Hi, this is LoCoco. Welcome back to my podcast channel. Before we get started on our topic today, I just wanted to wish all my listeners a very Merry Christmas. I hope you enjoy spending time with your family and friends and that you have a very joyous few days off from work and a wonderful holiday. Today, I'm thrilled to be sitting across the table from Miss Elisa Speranza, a New Orleans writer and the author of a new novel entitled The Italian Prisoner. I hope by the end of today's conversation you'll be amazed at the story that she's about to tell. Welcome, Miss Elisa.
Good morning. Great to be here. Buongiorno.
Buongiorno. So, 51,000 Italian Sicilian POWs between the year of 1943 and 1945 came to America, where they were housed throughout various camps in numerous states across across the United States. One of those states was Louisiana, correct?
Correct.
What is your novel, The Italian Prisoner, about?
So The Italian Prisoner is inspired by that story, which I didn't know, even though I am Italian, and even though I live in Louisiana, and a lot of people are surprised to hear that. When I found out that we had Italian prisoners of war at Jackson Barracks here in New Orleans, and that they met and mingled with and got to be friends with and into relationships with local families and local women. And one thing led to another. So that's what inspired the story.
And your protagonist in the story is who?
Her name is Rose Marino, and she's 18 when the story opens. She lives with her parents above the grocery store that they run in the French Quarter.
And she is she single, of course?
Yes.
And is she working?
Well, at the story opens, she has just agreed to take a job at the Higgins shipyard against her parents' wishes.
And for a woman at that age, at that time in New Orleans, they really did not work.
No, before the war especially, they might work in the family grocery store as she did, but they really were expected, even at that age, to, when are you getting married, when are you having kids? But in Rose's case, and in the case of many other young women and all kinds of people during World War II, they were being recruited to work in the war industry because the men were off at war, of course.
And for those listeners, either from New Orleans or not from New Orleans, who are unaware of Andrew Higgins, could you let everyone know who Andrew Higgins was?
Dwight Eisenhower said Andrew Higgins was the man who helped us win the war. He was the inventor of the Higgins boat, which everyone has seen on all the films and newsreels about D-Day and other invasions where the boats pull up to the beach and the ramp comes down and the jeeps roll off. Those are landing craft that were made here in New Orleans during the war. Andrew Higgins invented those boats for the oil and gas industry in Louisiana, in the shallow bayous of Louisiana, and had the brilliant idea to sell them to the Navy. And they really did allow our troops to land on the beaches and not in the ports, which was a key strategic advantage during the war. He was quite a character. He employed 20,000 people in 7 factories, integrated factories, which was quite a novelty in the Jim Crow South also, during the war, and had a huge impact on supplying the troops during the war.
I grew up near City Park.
Yes.
I know he had one plant close to Bayou St. John.
Right.
And my dad would always tell the story. As a little boy, he remembered walking along the banks of Bayou St. John, and all the Higgins boats would be lined up waiting to go out to the lake to run practice out
right.
there.
Buoyancy tests, yes.
Buoyancy
I saw a
tests,
couple of
absolutely.
pictures of that, them lined up and you just can't imagine, if you walk to Bayou St. John today, that much industry right on the banks of Bayou St. John, and then taking them out to the lake to test them for buoyancy, and then off they went to the war.
So Rose is living in the French Quarter. Of course, we're not going to get too much into the book because that's why we want people to read the book. But
Yes.
I just want to touch on one thing. So these Italian POWs, Sicilian POWs, are staying at the Jackson Barracks, and Rose is living in the French Quarter. And what happens to her? How does she end up meeting some of these characters?
So in real life, the U.S. government came to various communities that were nearby to these Italian POW camps and asked for their help to try to keep these guys busy, because they didn't want them to cause trouble. By that point, Italy had surrendered in September of 43, which I had totally forgotten, and switched sides in the war, so they were no longer enemy combatants, and they were given certain freedoms as a result. They were allowed out to people's homes for dinner. They were allowed out eventually to dances and to outings and to church and various other things. So in the book, it's a reflection of what happened in real life. The church, the local business community, and others in the Italian Hall, which was on Esplanade Avenue, which you can still see, it's condos now, they got together and they brought women of the parish over to Jackson Barracks with food. They could speak Italian with these guys and to visit with them. And Rose didn't want to go. She and her friend Marie are kind of talked into it by the parish priest and Father Tony and their parents. And they get dragged over to Jackson Barracks, and all of a sudden they show up and there's 1,000 good-looking young Italian guys just anxious to have their company. And Rose meets Sal at the barracks, and one thing leads to another.
I will say that your book does a phenomenal job, number one, of describing what life was like here in New Orleans during the war. And the love story it tells is just beautiful.
Thank you. It was fun to write.
I want to get away from your novel because, like I said, I want people to read it and get more into the research behind the novel. Because what I found fascinating was the number of families that you spoke to, couples who actually married and remained in New Orleans afterwards. Can you just tell a little bit about your research and how you came about it?
Yeah, the whole inspiration for the story, as you've talked about in your podcast, inspiration, very important, came from Joe Feroldi, who runs Lakeview Seafood and Burgers up on Harrison Ave. His father was an Italian prisoner of war, and his mom was a local Sicilian girl, and that's how they met, same as in the story. Joe told me that story back in 2003, shortly after I moved to New Orleans, and it stuck with me all those years, and I would pay attention to stories about that. But it wasn't until I left my corporate job and had the time to look into it that I met Sal Serio, who ran the Italian-American Research Library over in Jefferson Parish Library. Sal sadly passed away a month after the book came out, which may rest in peace. Without him, I'm not sure there would be a book. But he helped me find 10 families in the local area, all of whom are still around, the descendants of these 10 POWs who are at Jackson Barracks and local Sicilian women who they met during the war. And through their stories and their generous sharing of their family histories and whatnot, and one of the POWs who was still alive, John DeStefano, he just passed away last week. No. 2 weeks ago.
Really?
Yeah, very sad. And but he was 99, so he had a good ride, and he was a lovely, lovely man, and shared his stories with me, and I'm so grateful for that, and his beautiful family. And some of those stories did make their way into the book as well. We also found one of the women, the wives, who was still alive at the time, and got to interview her, got to hear some oral histories. My friend Linda DiMarzio Massico, whose mother and aunt both married Italian POWs, was also very helpful in the research. And we just dug in and we read and we found, artifacts and stories and reports and news articles and put it all together.
I'm a Lakeview resident, and therefore I didn't know the history behind the Lakeview burger. And
yeah, you'll have to go see
fun.
Chef Joe.
That's quite fascinating.
He's a great guy, yeah.
So after the war was over, did these POWs remain here, or did they go back? And then what happened? Like, did they get married here? What happened?
So after the war was over, so now it's the fall of 1945. By the Geneva Convention, they had to repatriate these prisoners. They had to send them back to Italy, and of course, by then Italy was in ruins from the war. It was needed a lot of rebuilding. There was going to be a long time. But they had to send them back. They went back to their families. But the women that they had met and become engaged to, in some cases, actually went over there, a little bit later, probably 46, middle of 46, 47. They went over there. They got married, a lot of them in Sicily, where their families were from. The Messina girls married the two POWs in a double wedding in the same church in Cefalù where their parents had gotten married. And there's a great picture of that. But there were double weddings. There were, all kinds of Battaglia girls. There were 4 Battaglia sisters that married 4 POWs. Their cousin was Felicia De Anna, who married Joe Feroldi. So there were a lot of intertwined families. Most of them went over there. Most of them got married over there and waited until the paperwork came through to bring their husbands back. They needed a sponsor. They needed a job. Like everything else, they needed to get permission to come back. But the women, I give them credit because they left the relative comfort of the French Quarter, in the 1940s for what it must have been a very difficult situation, living with relatives, maybe living, staying with their new husbands' families who they didn't know, who were on mainland Italy, most of them,
Right.
And waiting out, the deprivations of post-war Italy for love, and then bringing the husbands back here and starting families. And they're all still around. The children, the grandchildren of those families are still in the greater New Orleans area.
So let me ask you this question. So when they first got here, were they, and I'm just not Louisiana, but other states as well, were they accepted? Or were they, looked at with scorn? What was their...
Yeah, when they first got here before Italy surrendered, I would say, there was a lot of skepticism. These were enemy combatants. People had sons and, brothers fighting over there, and, they were wary of them. But yet, there were large Italian communities in various places here in Louisiana, in Boston, in New York, San Francisco, where there were family ties even with some of these guys, where they had sympathy for them, even though they were patriotic Americans and they were anxious to prove that. So there was some mixed feelings, and it did set up some conflicts in various places. There were also those who, even after Italy surrendered, objected to what they called the coddling of the POWs, where they were...
Correct? I think Higgins himself.
And Higgins himself wrote a letter to Congress objecting. He saw them out at Pontchartrain Beach and, hanging around the French Quarter with women, and he was offended by that because he was a big patriot. He was, all in for, fighting the war. But most of these guys had been conscripted by Mussolini. They were not fascists. They were not ideologues. They were not political. They were just young kids that were drafted into the war, and Mussolini had left them starving in the desert in North Africa. Most of them were excited to be captured. Some of them surrendered to unarmed medics. And when they found out they were coming to the United States, the boat came in and they saw the Statue of Liberty. They were just thrilled.
Now, I was going to ask you, when they came over, most of them came from Africa, correct? Most of them were
North
captured in
Africa,
North Africa.
right.
They came in through New York?
Some of them came through New York, some came through Norfolk, Virginia, and other ports, but mostly they were sent to farm communities at first because there was such a labor shortage. So wherever there was an army base or a camp near a farm, that's where a lot of them were sent first. Subsequently, there were waves of German POWs that came to the United States from all over, and the Italians were moved around, and that's when they moved them to places like New Orleans. So our POWs had a couple stops in between, including Nebraska and I think in Texas.
And they end up here, and this is where they found love.
Yes, yes.
I want to go back to one thing you talked about your character, Rose Marino, because what I found fascinating was, I didn't think about it really until I read your book, was she gets a job at Higgins. She's now a working woman. And the war is going to end.
Right.
And what's going to happen to her job? Because the men are going to come back from the war.
Right. I mean, women were heavily recruited. There were great propaganda posters, really targeting young women to come and work. And once they got there, they were told, well, it's just for the duration. You heard this phrase, for the duration, a lot. As soon as the men come back, you can return to the life you always wanted, cooking and cleaning and having babies. Well, that's a noble profession, but not all the women wanted that. And Rose, was conflicted about that. And, she loved her job. She was good at it. Her advice was valued. She was a bookkeeper. She had, a lot of input into the systems in the shipyard. And what I found in my research is there were a lot of women like that, a lot of women that went to work, liked having a few dollars in their pocketbook, liked having not to ask their parents for money or rely on anybody else to buy a dress or whatever they wanted, and to have a little bit of control over their own destiny. And then at the end of the war, they were told, thank you for your service. Now the men are going to come back and take your place. And that did happen, and a lot of the women weren't happy about it. Of course, they were happy the war was over and, that the men were home safely. That it wasn't that. It was that they wished they, too, could keep working.
So I want to ask you, how did you get into your writing? So did you start out as a writer? What did you do with your life?
No, I've always loved to write, and I've been a big reader since I could read, as a kid. But I never wrote fiction. I was a journalist early in my career. I worked 30-something years in business and government, in the critical infrastructure industry, having nothing to do with any of this. But when my company was sold in 2017 and I finally had a flexible schedule, I was still working, but I had control over my time a little more. I had that story in my pocket from Joe Feroldi from decade before, and I was terrified that someone else was going to write the story. Maybe it would have been you if I had waited long enough.
I swear to you, I'm not lying, but I had read an article many years ago in Gambit, I think, had written an article about the Italian POWs, and it was more about the German POWs who stayed here.
More people know about those.
Correct. And I remember my family had a farm, and I think some German POWs used to come work on the farm, so I kind of knew the story. And I always thought, oh, that'd be a great story to tell, but I could never formulate the story. But I think it was meant for you to tell because you told it so well. It's
funny. I read a book. A friend of mine gave me a book called Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert, all about ideas, and it scared me to death because it said if you have a great idea that's been eating at you for years, if you don't do something about it, whether it's an invention or a book or whatever it is, it's going to find another host. And I thought, well, I better get after this. And then I met Sal Sirio, who was 84 at the time, and he kept saying to me, when are you going to finish this book, So, and then the pandemic came, which was so horrible for so many people. But for me, it meant I was not traveling anymore for work, and I had no excuse but to sit down and write. I did get some help. I attended workshops over the years. I would dabble and attend a writing workshop here or there. And here in New Orleans, we have a wonderful resource, the New Orleans Writers Workshop, which helped me enormously, both with writing classes, but also with one-on-one coaching. It's one thing to have an idea for a book. It's another to write something that people will want to read.
I want to ask you about your cover. I just find it's a beautiful cover.
Thank you.
Just tell me what exactly is it?
It's a little different from a historical novel. It's from a painting by a local artist named Deidre Ludwig, who I urge everybody to check out. She's amazing. This is a painting that I own, and it's called Capistrano. And as people may know, the Swallows come back to Capistrano, the mission in California, on St. Joseph's Day, which is March 19th. And once I remembered that, and the working title of this book was St. Joseph's Day, by the way, which Sicilians in New Orleans know about, but most people, most places don't. It's a very big holiday here, as you know. And it's featured in the book as well. So once I kind of put that together, it seemed like fate. And it's a beautiful, beautiful painting. I love it. There's a lot of movement in it. There's a lot of different emotions in it. And I think it suits the book very well.
I always get asked from readers, so what is your writing I'd say style, or how do you go about writing per day or whatever? What would you do? How would you do every day?
Yeah, I have a lot of things that I count as writing. Like if I'm taking a walk and I'm thinking about my characters, that counts as writing,
Correct.
Right? As research counts as writing. Anything I would do, I would try every day to move the story forward one way or another, whether that was the research or writing or revision or character development or even just sometimes walking around the French Quarter to remember what a certain corner looked like before I would sit down to write about it. I tend to be an afternoon writer. I wish I was a morning person. I am not. But this is for all you people out there who are not morning people. You can write in the afternoon. So
I'm a morning writer.
You're lucky you. I would find the laundry would be done. Everything else is get done before I would sit down around 3 o'clock.
Do you have a spot where you write?
I do. Upstairs in my house in the Marino, I have a little garret with the sloped roofs, just like you'd picture, with a skylight in case the floodwaters come. That opens, which is great. And that's where I do most of my writing.
And do you, relative to the research, do you do all your research first and then start to write? Because I'm going to tell you I think I know what your answer is going to be.
It's a great question, and the answer is no. I thought it would be that way.
Me too, but it's not.
But no, and frankly, you could spend the rest of your life doing the research and never get a word down of the story. So now what I do is I write, and if I don't know something, and often you'll start writing a scene, as you know, and it's like, oh, I don't know, what dresses would they have worn to the dance in 1944? And if you start down that rabbit hole on the internet, which is your friend and your enemy, 2 hours later, you're looking at dress patterns still on the internet, and you haven't written a word. So now I put a placeholder and say, look this up later, look that up later. Because if
get
you
the
don't
story
keep
forward.
writing, you lose the thread of the story. And then, so now I come back and do the research. And I found a lot of research that I did for the first book that never made it into the book, but it was good for me to know and good for the backstory development. But I did probably spend a lot of time on that could have been better spent.
And now we get to the I guess this is for the aspiring writers out there, our tidbit, and that is, and I kind of agree with you. You write the story, but the key is, if you're writing the chapter for the day, get through the chapter.
Right.
Just write the chapter.
Right.
And like you said, no, I need to go back and research this, because when you write historical fiction, which I know you've already found out, you better be spot on. When it comes to facts, because somebody's going to point out to you that that's not what they wore, and that's not what
Absolutely.
they ate.
There's one thing and sometimes you have creative license. There is one thing in there that is historically inaccurate, which is that plastic on the sofa was not a thing until the late 40s. But I had to have the plastic on the sofa because that's what my grandmother had. So no one's called me on it, but I'm outing myself on that.
One question that we always get asked as writers is, your characters, are they based on a part of you or somebody that you know or friends or family? And how would you answer that question?
Yeah, great question. And as you know, it's probably a conglomerate. Most of these characters are bits and pieces of yourself, maybe, and people that you know. And if you grew up in an Italian family with Italian friends of your parents, you have no shortage of names to use. So a lot of the names in the book are family friends or people I knew, things like that. The closest character in the book to someone I know is Rose's godmother, Aunt Inez, who is pretty much based on my own godmother, who is quite a character herself. So, that part is fun, but you also have to be careful, because if you're writing characters who aren't very likable, and people think that they're, based on someone that you know, for example, the mother in my book, not very likable, I had to put a disclaimer at the end that she was not my mother, because my mother is still very much with us, and I wouldn't want people thinking that.
That's great. I read one description of your book that said, inspired by little-known historical events and set to a swing-era soundtrack. I wanted to just talk about, because you'd be remiss if we didn't mention Italians, Sicilians in particular, and their connection to music here in New Orleans.
Yeah, absolutely. I might have become a little obsessed with Louis Prima while I was writing this book.
Good old Louis Prima.
And if people outside of New Orleans don't know, Louis Prima was a favorite son of New Orleans, a trumpeter and a band leader and a singer. And he appears briefly in the book as a character, but there's actually a playlist for this book on my website, because I got so into what was the music of the day, which was swing music. I think that people needed that uplifting beat to get through a very dark time. And if you listen to the music of that era, it's almost, there's some ballads, but there's also a lot of upbeat music. A lot of swing dancing was huge here in New Orleans and elsewhere, of course, around the world. So the music is a very big part of the book, and I hear it in my head. I heard it, while I was writing. I was listening to 1943, 1944 era songs, and it's a big part of the book. But Louis Prima, of course, left his mark both on music, on jazz, on entertainment here and elsewhere. And his daughter Lena still performs at the Monteleone.
I've been to her performances.
It's wonderful.
Often. She plays all her dad's music. And
she does. It's just wonderful. So you can still hear a lot of Louis around town.
Did you get to talk to her about the book?
I did. In fact, when the book came out, I had a short list of people that I wanted to put the book in their hands. And I went to the Monteleone and caught her during a set break and wrote an inscription to her. I told her dad was in the book, and her eyes filled up, and I was very pleased to be able to hand the book to her, and I hope she liked it.
Well, music, like I said, plays such a huge role here in New Orleans. I'm glad I'm glad you made him part of your book.
Me too.
At the end of the day, your story is really, yes, it's about Italian POWs, but it's really a true love story. And I just find it's very difficult as a writer, I find, to describe love in writing. Do you find that?
I think it's really hard, yeah. And, it's a love story, but it's not a romance novel. And there's nothing wrong with romance novels, let me just say. I mean, a lot of great romance novels out there, but that's not what I was writing. And straddling that line, between a love story, but not giving into the love story to make that the only defining characteristic, especially for women, I think. I was very conscious of that, to make Rose her own person and not just a reflection of Sal,
Right.
There were other characters in the book who, followed a more traditional path. Nothing wrong with that. But the women that I met in real life and knew, found out about in real life, they were characters. I mean, they had their own life. They had their own careers, some of them. They were artists. They were business women. They did other things. So I wanted to make sure that the love story didn't eclipse everything else. Having said that, Rose as a young woman falling in love for the first time really was fun to write, and challenging to write without, straying into trite, things and stories, the things that everyone's read in every other book. You wanted to make it unique.
And these characters, and not so much even the characters, but the real people you met are going to stay with you for the rest of your life.
Oh, my goodness. The characters in the book will stay with me for the rest of my life, but certainly the real people will as well. As you know, sometimes, and authors used to tell me this before I started writing, that the characters become like members of the family. They'll wake you up at night and tell you things, and they certainly do. I keep a pad of paper next to my bed, and sometimes I do wake up and the characters are telling me something that I have to write down and act on. They take on lives of their own. And I, having finished this book and published it in April of this year of 2022, I kind of miss my people.
Right.
You
hate to see it end. There's a great movie called The Man Who Invented Christmas.
Yeah.
It's a story of Charles Dickens when he's writing the Christmas Carol. And it's just amazing how he's sitting in his room or whatever, and the characters are all talking to him.
Right.
And I'm not saying the characters talk to you, but
they do. They do. I mean,
they kind of you're always thinking about them.
Yeah. And even we joke, and my husband will say, "Well, what would Rose think of that?" Or what would Auntie Nez do? So yeah, they do become like real people.
So where is the book available?
The book is available everywhere books are sold. I always encourage people to buy from their local independent booksellers. Here in New Orleans, there are books available at Octavia, at Garden District Bookshop, at Barnes & Noble and Metairie. Signed copies are available there. But you can also order them anywhere on the internet that books are sold. There's also an audiobook. There's a hardcover. There's an ebook. So no excuses not to read. It's also in the libraries.
I will say her reviews have been outstanding. If you go to Amazon and look at her reviews, I think it's 4.7 stars, which is...
It's been great. People are connecting with the story, and that's really gratifying.
Are you working on anything else?
I am. I'm working on the second book now, and it's from the point of view of Rose's sister Laura, who is an Army nurse. And in the first book, you don't get to meet her except through her letters home to Rose. And I was intrigued by Army nurses. They don't get a lot of credit for what they did, and they were right there on the front lines with the men. So I've started to deep into nurse journals and letters home.
So now all of a sudden all the research goes negative.
Yes, too much. Yes, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And what they came home with, some of the same traumas that the men came home with, that unfortunately back in the 50s, we didn't have a name for it, and we didn't treat it as well as we should have.
It's that's gonna be another fascinating book to read. Because I liked her in the story. I liked reading her letters and her take on where she was and kind of what she was seeing, and you could see it was affecting her even in the Italian prison. It was affecting her.
Definitely is. I think a lot of these letters home from either from soldiers or nurses or people in the war, they were censored, but they also edited themselves because they didn't want to upset their families too much. By really saying what they saw. So that caused even more stress on them, I think.
So in closing, I'm going to ask you this question. So your last name's Speranza. If for any fans out there of Puccini, whose birthday is coming up on December 22nd, I guess, in the aria from La Boheme, Che gelida menina, he sings the high C on the word Speranza, which means...
Awesome. Hope.
Can't hit the high C today, but I'll hit it one another
I'll
day.
have to go check that out.
So, Italian, living in New Orleans, great Italian history here, great Italian restaurants. Do you have a favorite Italian restaurant?
I do, and it's a little bit of an unconventional answer probably, but Gianna in the Central Business District is a phenomenal restaurant, and a woman chef she comes by it honestly. Her grandmother is Italian. She's got some of those recipes, but with a modern twist. I was just in there a couple weeks ago with my book club, and we had a tremendous meal. So all due respect to the more old school restaurants here, which I also love, but right now Gianna's probably my favorite.
And anyone with a book club who needs an author to come, or would want an author to come talk to them, you are
absolutely. I love to talk to book clubs. I've done a bunch of them either on Zoom if they're not around, or locally. I'll do them in person. So everyone can find me right through my website, ElisaSperanza.com.
Well, thanks for coming so much, and like I said, I was fascinated with your story, and I hope our audience was as well.
Well, thank you so much, Chip, and buon Natale.
Buon Natale, ciao.